up until the 1970s, New York, by and large, funded its investment requirements, but after 1975, it was not in a position to do so. Because the settlement that came to New York was largely the settlement in which the principle was established that the bondholders and the financial institutions would not suffer. They would be guaranteed their rate of return, and they would be guaranteed. Who would suffer would be the people, and would be the municipality or the state or whatever the institution was. Now, this is a very interesting thing, because what it does is to encourage something which we have to this day, which is something called moral hazard. A moral hazard arises because if the banks are not going to suffer from any bad decision, then they'll go ahead and make any old decision. Why not? And they are not going to be held accountable for bad decisions. If they make bad investment decisions, you would expect them to bear the cost. But basically what happened in the New York fiscal crisis was a situation was set up in which the bondholders and the financial institutions which lent money were not going to be affected. And moral hazard, therefore, allowed the banks and the financial institutions to lend whatever, for whatever, with no worries about not getting the money back, because if the crisis occurred of some kind, then that crisis would be resolved by the state stepping in and paying off, making sure that the bankers are paid off, whereas the entity which is there is seriously, it can be seriously hurt. Now, what was interesting about this was that this is not, really, this wasn't really well received in many economics circles. And there's a very interesting kind of thing right now that the economists who are not powerful and the bankers who were not powerful in 1945 and 1960s and so on, they started to come into their own a lot. And so the question arose around this time, well, if the New York solution is going to become global, if it's going to become general policy, how is it going to be implemented as general policy? And the answer was, well, we need to have a theory which will help us. And that theory was, of course, the neoliberal or supply-side theory, as it was set up by Hayek, Milton Friedman, and all the rest of it. So you suddenly found the Keynesian theory, which had been, in a sense, sacrosanct during the 1960s, which got into trouble because of its inflationary implications. The Keynesian theory was not able to accommodate to this new reality of, bailing out the banks without any kind of problem, or without any and engaging in moral hazard. It wasn't able to deal with that. So you get, at this point, the big guns and the corporate heads casting around for a kind of sign, this is what we're doing. Now, my argument here is this, that neoliberalism is often presented as a set of ideas that became hegemonic for some reason or other. Well, there's a certain truth to that. But my own view is that neoliberalism was something which arose because the class power wanted to do something and it needed a rationale to do it. And it looked around for a rationale and it found it. And it found it in neoliberal theory. So in a sense, what we have is, kind of Marxist kind of terms. The ruling ideas at any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. And how did they get articulated? Well, the ruling class at that time, the Rockefellers and heads of General Motors and all the rest of it, were looking for a theory that would justify their. And then there was this theory lying around, which had been there for, actually since the 1920s, and been articulated through the Mont Pelerin Society and so on during the 1950s and 1960s. These ideas were lying around, but they were not respectable ideas. So they had to be made respectable. And how do you make them respectable? Well, one of the things you do is you call up your friends in Sweden and say, how about awarding Nobel Prizes to Hayek and Milton Friedman, which of course they did. So suddenly this idea starts to become respectable. These ideas become respectable in the think tanks, which were being set up by these large corporate entities and wealthy donors. These think tanks were all of them think tanks which were developing this kind of theoretical standpoint, which is a set of ruling ideas for the ruling class of that time. And these ruling ideas were those in which supply-side conditions become foundational for public policy. Public policy should take care of the supply on the inputs, as it were, and the demand will look after itself. The Keynesian view had been demand analysis, and supply will come up to match demand. So it was a supply-side theory which was being advocated in response to the Keynesian theory, which was the demand-side theory.